So in the last episode, we looked at creating the decoder for a post of our feed. And today we're going to actually make a request to the feed endpoint of our API to fetch the feed for the logged in user. And now we need to create a decoder that can decode a list of these. So I'm going to say feed decoder. And this will be a decoder that decodes into a list of feed post. And feed decoder is going to equal simply d.list feed post decoder, because from the API we get back an array of all our posts. So in a minute we're going to need to think about how we put this in our model and where we store the data, but for now what we can do is just make the request and get it logged in the browser. So what I'm going to do just for a moment is I'm going to pop open another pane and look at the api.elm file. And I know it's a bit squished because of the resolution we're at, but I want to take this HTTP builder part and just yank it into here because it's going to look very similar. What we're going to do in a bit is actually refactor this because we've got a lot of code now which makes a request and adds the token and so on. So let's close that and that so we can get back to one thing. So let's call this fetch feed. And it's going to take a token and it's going to return a command of type message. So we'll say fetch feed and we'll do the token destructuring tick as well. So we can say token. And instead of API/me, it's API/feed. This will give us the feed for the user. With header x token, which is correct. Then we are expecting JSON, but it's not going to be user decoder now. It's going to be the feed decoder. And we're going to HTTP builder.send, and we'll just have a function here called handle feed response. And I'll save that, let it format itself. So it can't find handle feed response. So we're going to create handle feed response. And it's going to take as an argument a result that could either be http.error or it will be a list of feed post if it all went well. And it needs to return a message. So handle feed response result. I'm going to do the old logging trick. We'll say let underscore equals debug.log feed result in no-op. So if we go up to the top of the file, we can actually update the exposes here. We don't need the feed post decoder to be exposed. The only thing we need to expose is how we get one of these. So we'll expose the fetch feed function. What we'll do now is we'll head into our main.elm. So once we're in main.elm, we now need to import this module and actually make the request. So I'm going to import api.feed, and I'm going to expose it as feed. And remember, it's api.feed because the folder that feed.elm lives in is called API. So you see here it's API feed.elm. That's why the module is called api.feed, and therefore that's how we import it here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our update and we're going to look for the part of the update function where we get the logged in user and we confirm that the user is logged in. So that's here. And this is where we fetch the followed users as well and we list them. This is also where we can say feed.fetch feed. And this is now the second part of what update returns needs to be a command of type message. We now have two of them, so we can wrap those in a command.batch like that. And let's just save that and let Elm format do its thing. And we're getting an error here. Type mismatch, the second element of this is not match. The fetch feed value is a token. Of course, we need the actual token as well. So we'll take the token and we'll pass it into fetch feed. Great. Let's go and have a look in the browser and see if that's working. So you can see here we have an issue. It says error bad payload. Problem with the value at JSON naught. So it looks like we haven't quite got a decoder working. And although there's quite a lot going on here, it's quite hard to pick out the error. You can see we get one here. It says expecting an object with a field name post ID. What we'll do first is we'll look at what the API is actually responding. So if we look for the feed request, you can see here it returns a list of things. They have content, created at ID, published at tags, title, updated at, and the user. So let's go and compare this to what our decoder says and see where the mistake is. So I think the issue is here we said there's a field called post ID. But if we look back at the JSON in Chrome, you'll see that it's actually called ID. Similarly, we have user ID, but actually the user's ID is inside this object as user.id. So we need to do a bit of work to update our decoder for both those situations. So the first bit of work is easy. Rather than post ID, we'll just say ID. And you can see now we still have the bad payload, but you can see the error is down here and it says expecting an object with a field named user ID. We don't have that, but we do have an ID field within the user part of the response. So when you need to reach into a nested object to pull out a field, you can swap from d.field to d.at. What d.at does is it takes a list of keys which it will look in. So we'll change user ID to user, and then we'll add another one of ID. And what this is saying is, reach into the user object, find the ID field, and that's the value I want to use. This is really handy if you've got big nested objects. You don't actually care about the whole object, you just care about one particular field, such as the ID. Now in our browser, you can see we have feed is okay with this array of posts. So we are now able to fetch the posts and decode them successfully. Let's think about where we want to put them in the model. So I'm in types now, and I'm looking at what we could do to store the feed in our model. One option is we could put it here. We could have feed, and it could either be a list of feed posts, or maybe it would be a list of feed posts. But if you think back to earlier in this series where we talked about invalid states, you could end up, if you had this type, of auth being a logged out user, but still having a feed of posts. It's obviously, we could code it so it'd be very hard to get into that state, but it is possible. A feed is something that only a logged in user has. So I think what we should do is look at updating this logged in state here to include a feed in some form. So logged in has a token and it has a user, and I think now it maybe will also have to maybe have a feed. The reason it's a maybe is because we might not have fetched it yet, in which case we want it to be nothing, rather than just being an empty list by default. But this type does let us document quite clearly that you can only be logged in to have a feed. Most places in the application, like if you look at a user's profile, when we get to building those, you can see those even if you're logged out. A logged out user can come to my profile on this distinctly average blogging site and see it, but no one can see the feed unless they're logged in. So if you're logged in, you're going to have a token, a user, and then maybe a feed as well. Now, updating this type is going to break our code in a few places. We'll be destructuring this. So let's save this. This will cause some errors, and we can work our way through them. Of course, feed for a start isn't defined as a type, so I'm actually going to replace this with a list of feed post. You might think at this point that we should just create a type alias of feed, which equals a list of feed post. I used to do this quite a lot, but I've actually found that it can be easy to then forget later on, or to a new developer, that feed is a list. So I've actually tend to prefer the slightly more explicit list feed post. So let's leave it as maybe a list of feed posts. Now in the browser, you can see that we have too few arguments here. You can see the logged in constructor needs 3 arguments, but I see 2. So we're just now going to have to work through all the compiler errors. So we go model.auth of logged in token user, and then the final thing will be the feed, which we don't care about in this case, so we can just put an underscore there. If I pop open the problems part of the VS Code, we can see this view.elm here, and I can click that, and we can see here. So this is saying if the authentication status is logged in, we render the sign out button. So again, we can just put another underscore there. So that's the problems in that file. Let's go back to the browser. Okay, so now in source main.elm, so let's work our way through main.elm. So the first issue is on this line, and we need an extra underscore here. I think we don't need to update anything else in this fetching followed user logic. I think the update user function will work correctly, but actually we can go and check now and update it. And indeed, that's where our next error is. So update user takes an auth status and the user mapper. The auth status is a logged in user with user token user and maybe a feed. Then what we need to do is create that again. There we go, fetch authenticated user, token user. So this is when we get the user back. They're going to be logged in with this token and the user, and they're not going to have a feed at this point. So we're going to just set that to nothing. We then kick off a call to get the feed, but at the start when they first log in, they won't have a feed, so we'll set it to nothing. And you can see now we're back to green. We have the compiler working, and we still got our feed being logged out here. Notice how we just made quite a fundamental change to the way we structure our data. We added to the authentication status type. But all we had to do to get things working again was just work our way through those errors one at a time. This is one of the best things about Elm. It's really good at guiding you through refactorings. It's why often I make quite big refactorings, or I'm not afraid to make quite big data structure changes, because I know the compiler is going to tell me all the places where it's wrong, and I can just work through them one at a time. To finish this episode off, let's actually look at now grabbing the feed and putting that into our model. So the first thing we need to do is add a message when we fetch the feed. So let's say fetch feed with a list of feed post, like so. Then in our feed.elm, we can say case result of. If it's an error, we're going to, for now, just no op. But again, I'm going to leave a to do, and we are going to come back in a future video. So we'll say to do show errors to the user. Else, if it's okay with some posts, what we're going to do is we'll say fetched feed posts. And let's just delete all that. So now we need to go into our main.elm, and we'll find our update, and we need to go to fetched feed with the posts. So what we now need to do is update the authentication status with those new posts. So we're going to destructure on the authenticated user to do this. So we'll say case model.auth of, and if it is logged in with a token and a user, and then anything for the post because we're about to override them, then in this case what we're going to do is do our work. So we'll say let new auth equals logged in with the token and the user, and then we need to wrap the post member in a maybe. And then what we can do is we can return model auth equals new auth, and for now command.none. If it's any other status, if we're not logged in, then we're just going to return the model and command.none and just not do anything. Okay, save that, and that looks to be all good. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to debug.log this as well. So we'll say debug.log new auth and wrap that all in brackets. So I've just refreshed the browser and you can see our new auth has been logged here. We're logged in with our token. This bit here is my user. So I'm Jack Franklin, this is my user ID. And then you can see this big long list of blog posts here. And this makes up my feed. In the next episode, we're going to take this data and actually look at how we can render it and build a new module that can view a feed and show it on screen to the user.